My name is Clara Lawson, and until a year ago, I believed love could never betray me. I was born into power, raised beneath glass towers my father built, and married the man I thought would protect my heart. But behind every promise he made, a darker plan was unfolding, one that would cost me everything my family ever built. What began as love turned into the deepest betrayal, and what followed became my revenge. Where are you watching from, friends? Drop your location in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more unforgettable stories like this one. Seattle shimmered beneath a curtain of mist that night, the skyline glinting like a field of glass. Inside the top floor of the Harbor Line Hotel, every light and laugh belonged to the name Lawson. Victor Lawson, the man who built his empire out of steel, contracts, and sheer command, was celebrating two things he prized above all: his 59th birthday and the city's approval of a massive waterfront development bearing the Lawson insignia. Waiters drifted between tables like clockwork, trays balanced with champagne and oysters. A jazz trio played near the bay windows, the soft brass coiling through the air. From the terrace, the reflection of Elliott Bay glittered, as if the water itself were applauding him. In the center of it all stood Clara Lawson, Victor's only daughter, 28, graceful, deliberate. Her silver dress caught the light like a quiet flame. She smiled when the cameras turned toward her, nodded during toasts, and played the part expected of her: the perfect daughter, the poised heir. She had grown up in this world of handshakes, ribbon cuttings, and smiles sharpened by ambition, but the role felt smaller every year. People looked at her not as a person, but as a bridge, something men crossed to reach her father's empire. And tonight, that bridge had a name: Adrian Volkov, son of a wealthy investor Victor hoped to anchor to the Lawson name. Adrian was tall, expensively bored, and spoke of cars as if they were people. When he laughed, it was for himself. He told Clara they would look stunning together at future galas, as though marriage were another glossy photograph to frame. She listened only because she could feel her father's gaze across the room, the same gaze that had built skyscrapers, the one that tolerated no detour. After another toast, Clara excused herself to the balcony. The cool air rushed against her skin like truth. Below, the city pulsed with lights. Ferries slid across the dark bay like moving constellations. For a moment, she let herself imagine her old sketches, rolled up, forgotten blueprints of buildings she once dreamed of designing herself. "Happy birthday to your father," a voice said behind her. Clara turned. A man in a plain black suit stood a few steps away. His smile wasn't rehearsed. "And congratulations on the harborfront contract," he added. "I'm Evan Mercer." She knew the name. Her father had once mentioned a young project manager who had rescued a failing bid and earned a reputation for turning setbacks into solutions. Up close, Evan looked ordinary until you saw his eyes. There was steadiness there, and something rare in rooms like this: sincerity. "Thank you," she said, her tone cautious but warm. Inside, the band began a slow number. Evan extended a hand, not with showmanship, but with quiet courtesy. Clara hesitated only a second before accepting. On the dance floor, they moved as if the world had paused around them. Evan didn't speak about contracts or alliances. Instead, he asked where she liked to walk in the mornings, if she still sketched, if she ever designed for herself instead of her father's shadow. She laughed, soft, genuine, unplanned. For 3 minutes, she wasn't Victor Lawson's daughter. She was just Clara. When the music faded, Evan thanked her simply and stepped back. The absence of his hand felt almost tangible. Before she could process it, her father appeared. "Mr. Mercer," Victor said, his smile perfectly measured. "Enjoying the evening?" "Very much, sir," Evan replied. "You should be proud," Victor continued, and the "you" clearly meant me, the family, the company, the empire. His gaze cut to Clara. "My daughter, as promised for introductions tonight." Then to Clara. "Adrian's waiting by the bar." He guided her away with a firm hand at her elbow. "He's dependable," Victor murmured. "He understands what legacy means." "Legacy," she repeated under her breath, tasting the word like medicine. The rest of the evening unfolded like a blueprint. Flawless, suffocating. Toasts, photographs, smiles carved in glass. But the pattern left no room for breath. When she finally escaped back to the balcony, the air felt heavier. Her father joined her a moment later, his reflection flickering beside hers in the window pane. "You're making this difficult," he said quietly. "There's a difference between difficult and alive," Clara replied. "There are partnerships to honor. There's a life to live." He exhaled slowly, the sound of control. "Clara, we don't marry stories. We marry sense." She turned toward him, her voice steady. "Then I'll be the first exception. I won't marry Adrian." Victor's jaw tightened. "We'll discuss this at home." "We're discussing it now." The band swelled behind them. A new toast rose and broke like a wave. Her father didn't shout. He didn't need to. Power didn't raise its voice. It simply waited to be obeyed. That night, when the last glass clinked and the guests dispersed, Clara knew a line had been drawn. Love on one side, legacy on the other, and she had stepped across. The next morning, rain stitched gray threads down the windows of their Mercer Island home. Victor folded the newspaper and looked at her across the table, his voice calm but unyielding. "We should revisit what you said." "I meant it," she answered. "I won't marry him." "Love," he said, "is a currency that depreciates. Alliances endure." "And what am I, Father?" she asked quietly. "An investment?" The silence that followed was colder than the rain outside. Then, with the precision of a man drafting terms, he said, 6 months. If in that time you find someone I can respect, someone worthy of your hand, I will not press this match. Otherwise, you'll marry Adrian. My word is final." It wasn't freedom, but it was a window, and Clara had learned how to slip through narrow openings. A week later, she found herself standing in the lobby of Lawson Development. Across the marble floor, Evan Mercer was leaning over a table with engineers, sleeves rolled up, voice steady. When he noticed her, surprise flickered, then softened into something real. "Didn't expect to see you here," he said. "Neither did I," she replied, smiling, "but I'm glad I did." That brief meeting became coffee 2 days later at a small cafe on Pine Street, far from her father's polished circles. One coffee became 3. One conversation became many. Evan spoke of buildings like living things, how glass could breathe, how foundations had hearts. Clara spoke of sketches she had hidden for years. He didn't tell her what she should be. He asked what she wanted. Under soft lamplight and laughter, something impossible began to feel inevitable. 3 months later, under the cherry blossoms of Volunteer Park, Evan stopped mid-sentence. "Clara," he said quietly, "I don't want to be another passing name in your life. I love you." Her breath caught. Then she whispered, "I love you too." For the first time, the future didn't look like a contract. It looked like a choice. By the time summer reached Seattle's shores, the impossible had become unstoppable. Clara Lawson and Evan Mercer were no longer a secret whispered in corners. They were a quiet truth that refused to hide. At first, the gossip traveled softly through company halls, like a rumor carried on the hum of air conditioning. But whispers have a way of finding their mark. Eventually, one of them reached Victor Lawson. The confrontation came 2 weeks later in his office high above the city. The view stretched wide behind him. Cranes, bridges, the metallic sprawl of the empire he'd built. And Clara knew that, in his eyes, everything in that horizon belonged to him. Everything, including her. "He's not what I envisioned for you," Victor said, his voice measured but cold. "Ambition is not pedigree." "I don't need pedigree," she answered, standing taller. "I need someone who sees me as more than an extension of your empire." Victor studied her for a long moment, then turned toward the window. "If you truly want this man," he said at last, "he will sign a prenuptial agreement. It will protect what's ours, what I've built." When Clara told Evan, he didn't hesitate. "I'm not here for your father's company," he said, taking her hands. "I'm here for you. If a signature proves that, I'll sign 1,000 times." And so, 6 months after the night that divided her life, Clara Lawson became Clara Mercer. Their wedding took place beneath an archway of white roses in the courtyard of the old art museum, the same place Victor had unveiled one of his earliest buildings. The sky was pale gray, the kind of color Seattle reserved for solemn beginnings. The guest list was full of city dignitaries and business titans, but when Clara looked at Evan, steady, certain, she saw no one else. When they danced, she remembered the first time he had held her, back when she was still uncertain of her own freedom. Now his hands were sure. The music softened, and for a moment she allowed herself to believe she had done it. broken free from the blueprint of her father's design. The first 6 months of marriage felt like sunlight after years of shadow. They moved into the Lawson estate on Lake Washington, a cedar-framed masterpiece her father had built for her mother before Clara was born. Glass walls looked out over the water. The garden smelled of the roses her mother once tended herself. It became their home. Mornings began with the soft light spilling across their bed, Evan's hand tracing idle lines across her shoulder. She started sketching again in the sunroom, filling notebook after notebook with designs, her own visions this time, not her father's towers. Evan worked long hours managing projects, but he made time for her. Sunday breakfasts, walks through Pike Place Market, evenings spent dreaming aloud about the world they would build together. They spoke of travel, Paris in spring, Kyoto in fall. She even talked about teaching architecture someday, about reclaiming the passion she'd once shelved for duty. For the first time, her life wasn't scripted. It was hers. Then came the night that ended that dream. It was late October, the kind of night when rain falls sideways and traffic hums in endless lines of red light. Clara was sketching near the window when she saw the police cruiser pull into the driveway. Her first thought was confusion. Her second was dread. When the officer removed his hat before speaking, she already knew. Victor and Elise Lawson had been driving back from a weekend at the San Juan Islands when their car spun out on wet pavement and collided with a concrete barrier. Victor had died instantly. Elise survived 3 hours in critical condition before her heart gave out. The officer's words blurred into noise. Clara's body trembled, but her mind refused to process it. She called Natalie Carter, her oldest friend, her anchor since college, but her voice broke halfway through the sentence. The funeral passed like fog. Black umbrellas, condolences whispered through tears. Newspaper headlines that used words like legacy and visionary. None of it meant anything. Afterward, silence. Heavy, endless silence. Clara withdrew from the world. Days became nights, and nights bled into one another. She stopped answering calls, stopped drawing, stopped being seen. The house that once felt like a sanctuary now pressed against her like a tomb. Through it all, Evan was steady. He answered the phone when lawyers called, soothed investors when the board demanded her presence, and met with bankers when signatures were required. "You need time," he said gently one evening as she sat by the window, wrapped in her mother's shawl. "I'll take care of things until you're ready." And she believed him, because she needed to. Weeks turned into months. Evan began attending board meetings on her behalf. He consolidated accounts, restructured projects, and assured everyone that Lawson Development remained in capable hands. He brought her documents to sign, explaining they were routine approvals. She barely glanced at them. The company her father built, once the pulse of her childhood, became something distant, an abstraction buried under grief. Clara told herself she was lucky to have someone like Evan, someone strong enough to shoulder the weight she couldn't yet bear. "You're safe," he would say as he tucked her into bed. "That's all that matters." And she wanted to believe that was love, someone protecting you while you learned how to stand again. But grief has layers, and beneath hers, something else began to stir. Small, faint, like a whisper in her chest. Unease. A year passed, and the air inside the Lawson estate began to change. Natalie Carter visited often, refusing to let her friend fade into mourning. She filled the kitchen with flowers and laughter. She convinced Clara to take walks again, to breathe, to eat. And one day she even coaxed her to adopt a dog, a clumsy golden retriever Evan brought home and named Oliver. "You need something to pull you back to life," he'd said, smiling. Oliver became her shadow. He followed her from room to room, nosing open the door to her studio, curling up at her feet while she sketched again. For the first time since the accident, her pencil touched paper. She began to dream again. But while Clara rebuilt herself in small, fragile pieces, Evan was rebuilding something else entirely. He started staying late at the office, his explanations smooth and patient. "The downtown arena project needs oversight," he'd say. "The city's riding us hard on deadlines." She believed him. After all, he'd carried her through the darkest year of her life. He'd earned her trust. But trust, like glass, only seems unbreakable until the first crack appears. One night, as she hung his coat in the closet, a faint scent caught her attention. Perfume. Expensive. Unfamiliar. Not hers. She froze. then forced herself to dismiss it. "He meets hundreds of people," she whispered. "It's nothing." But nothing began to happen often. Calls at midnight, meetings that ran past 2 in the morning. The faintest trace of secrecy where there had once been openness. One Tuesday afternoon, she decided to surprise him. Evan had forgotten an important folder at home, and Clara thought it would be sweet to bring it to his office. His assistant smiled tightly when she arrived. "Mr. Mercer's in a meeting," she said, blocking the door. "It's all right," Clara replied. "I'll just drop this off." She opened the office door before the assistant could stop her. What she heard on the other side wasn't business. Laughter, soft, intimate, familiar only to lovers. Her breath caught. She didn't see anyone clearly, just the curve of a shoulder, the sound of Evan's voice low and warm, the kind of warmth he once reserved for her. The moment passed in seconds. But it split something deep inside her that would never fully mend. She handed him the folder, smiled as though her world hadn't just shifted, and left without another word. Outside, the rain began to fall again, tracing the glass walls of the tower like tears. That evening, the house felt too still. Clara sat in the sunroom, her untouched tea cooling beside her sketches. Outside, rain threaded silver lines across the glass, each drop echoing the slow unraveling of her trust. Oliver lay by her feet, sensing her silence, his tail occasionally thumping against the floor as if to remind her she wasn't alone. When Evan finally came home, his smile was weary but practiced. He kissed her cheek, thanked her for dropping off the folder, and disappeared upstairs to shower. The faint scent of unfamiliar perfume followed him down the hall. That night, long after he'd fallen asleep, Clara stared at the ceiling and tried to convince herself that grief was making her paranoid. But the truth sat in her chest like a stone. Something had shifted. The man who once spoke to her like she was the only light in his world now treated her as though she were a dim reflection of his ambition. The next morning, Evan suggested something unexpected. "You should take a break," he said over breakfast, his tone gentle. "Go away for a week or two. You've been through so much. Maybe the coast, somewhere quiet. Take Natalie with you." The idea stung at first. "You want me to leave?" He smiled, soft but insistent. "I want you to breathe. You've been trapped in this house too long." Natalie loved the idea. Within days, she had booked a small beach house on Whidbey Island. The air there was salt and cedar, the beaches lined with smooth gray stones and restless gulls. For the first few days, Clara allowed herself to feel calm. She and Natalie walked the coastline, shared wine by the fire, and talked about everything except grief and men. It should have been healing. It almost was. But on the 5th morning, Clara woke before dawn. The air was thick with an ache she couldn't explain, a pull to go home. "I want to surprise him," she told Natalie. "I miss him." Natalie looked uncertain, but nodded. "Call me when you get there, all right?" The ferry ride back to Seattle was quiet, the gray water rolling beneath the hull like a mirror of her thoughts. She rehearsed the moment in her mind, his surprised smile, her laughter, their reunion. Maybe she was wrong, she told herself. Maybe she was being unfair. When she arrived at Lawson Development that afternoon, the lobby buzzed with weekday energy. Evan's assistant looked startled when she appeared. "Mrs. Mercer, I didn't know you were coming." "I wanted to surprise him," Clara said warmly. "He's in, right?" The assistant hesitated, eyes flicking toward the frosted glass door of Evan's office. "He's in a meeting." Clara smiled. "I'll wait." And before the woman could object, she turned the handle. The door opened. The laughter inside was unmistakable, soft, familiar, intertwined with his, a woman's voice. Clara stepped in, her heart pounding like a fist. Evan sat on the edge of his desk, leaning close to a woman she recognized instantly, Isabel Hart, the company's new financial director, the one he'd hired 2 months ago. Isabel's hand rested lightly on his arm. His expression wasn't guilt or shock, it was irritation at being interrupted. "Clara," he said after a beat, his tone calm, controlled. "You weren't supposed to be back until Friday." Her throat went dry. "Clearly." Isabel stood quickly, smoothing her skirt. "I'll, give you 2 a moment." She slipped out, her perfume trailing behind her like a ghost. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them hummed with something sharp. Clara finally found her voice. How long? Evan didn't answer immediately. He reached for a pen on his desk, setting it down again, his composure infuriatingly intact. You don't understand, Clara. After your parents' deaths, you disappeared into yourself. The company, our life, someone had to hold it together. Her voice cracked. So you held her? He sighed, almost pitying. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. Clara laughed, soft, broken. You sound like my father. That night, she didn't cry. She packed a small bag, drove home, and locked herself in the guest room. The truth, she realized, didn't shatter her. It clarified her. The next morning, she walked into her father's study, the one Evan rarely entered, and opened the drawer that held the company's files. The smell of old cedar and paper filled the room. She began to read through the documents Evan had made her sign over the past year. What she found made her stomach twist. Hidden among the signatures and routine authorizations were transfers, ownership stakes, asset reallocations, all shifting control of Lawson Development to Evan Mercer. Bit by bit, with every signature, she had signed away her family's empire, and every page bore her name. Her hands trembled. It wasn't just betrayal, it was theft. Calculated, patient, legal. He hadn't married her for love. He'd married her to own everything her father built. Clara felt something inside her solidify. Not rage, not heartbreak. Something colder, sharper. Purpose. For 2 days, she said nothing. She played the part of the wounded wife, quiet, distant, watching. Evan assumed her silence meant surrender. He was wrong. On the third morning, she visited the company's legal division unannounced, requesting access to archived contracts. When the clerk hesitated, she smiled and invoked her maiden name, Lawson. The name still carried weight. By evening, she had everything she needed. A week later, she invited Evan to dinner. The table was set as it had been in their happier days. Candles, silverware, his favorite wine. He seemed relieved when he arrived, mistaking her calm for forgiveness. I've missed this, he said softly, pouring himself a drink. So have I, she replied. It feels good to sit across from the man who owns everything my father worked for. He froze, glass halfway to his lips. What are you talking about? She smiled, small, deliberate. I know about the transfers, the shell subsidiaries, Isabel's name on the new accounts. I know everything, Evan. He tried to recover, his voice suddenly stern. Clara, you don't understand corporate structure. I understand deceit, she interrupted, her tone icy. And I understand that you underestimated me. He set the glass down carefully. What do you want? Nothing, she said. Because by tomorrow, you'll have nothing. That night, she sent everything, every document, every transfer record, to the company's board, to the press, and to Victor Lawson's old partners who still owed her favors. Within 24 hours, the story broke across every business channel. Victor Lawson's widow's estate manipulated by husband, investigation underway. Evan Mercer's name flooded the headlines. The board called for an emergency vote. Accounts were frozen, contracts suspended. Isabel Hart resigned before dawn. When Evan came home that evening, his world was already collapsing. He found Clara in the sunroom, sketching, her expression calm. You destroyed me, he said hoarsely. She didn't look up. No, you destroyed yourself. I just stopped pretending not to see it. He stepped closer, desperate. Clara, please. We can fix this. She finally met his eyes. You can't fix what you built on a lie. For the first time, Evan's composure cracked. He left without another word. Days turned to weeks. Investigators took over Lawson Development's offices, and slowly, piece by piece, the company returned to her name. She sold Evan's shares, liquidated his assets, and donated a portion of the profits to rebuild an art scholarship her mother had once dreamed of funding. The rest she used to open Lawson Atelier, her own design firm, a space where she could finally create without permission. Months later, she stood on a new balcony overlooking the city, the skyline glowing in the evening mist. She traced the horizon with her eyes and thought of her father, not with bitterness, but with clarity. He had built towers, She had learned how to survive in their shadows. She whispered softly to the night, "I did it my way, Dad." Below her, the harbor lights flickered like slow applause. Then she turned, walked back inside, and closed the door, not to shut the world out, but to start anew.